Welcome to another episode of the Svarim Cheddar Podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by the Kalemar app, a clear way to learn Chumash Rashi. The text of each pasuk with Rashi Menukud and a shir by Rav Shalom Menachem Wolgelenter explaining each word of Rashi. The app is easy and simple to use, contains bookmark capability, a daily calendar, and is free to download. You can find the link in the show notes to download the Kalemar app. This episode is also sponsored by Zaidi Auctions. Check out the upcoming auction June 14th at 1 p.m. Eastern with 125 lots, including the Pri Chadash's personal copy of the Rashba with his signature and Hagois, a handwritten letter of Yeshayahu Basan, the Rebbe of the Ramchal, and a handwritten essay by Rav Shamash Raphael Hirsch on the state of the Jews of France, a letter of Rav Shaila of Kerestir, and much more. You can find the link and information in the show notes below, where you can check out the catalog and bid on items now. To sponsor an episode or to support the show, please email me svarimchatter@gmail.com or find the link and information in the show notes below. You can also find the link to subscribe to the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp community, where I post new books, new Svarim, book deals, and more. Also a link to the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp status if you prefer to see things that way. And finally, if you can please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. And enjoy this episode, which was recorded a while ago. Actually, we figured it's time to go back into the Svarim Chatter vault and pull out some older episodes. So enjoy this episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Svarim Chatter Podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Benjamin Fisher, who is the Associate Professor of Medieval and Early Modern Jewish History at Towson University, and we will be discussing his new book, which was published a year or two ago. I'm forgetting offhand as we start here, and it is titled Amsterdam's People of the Book, Jewish Society and the Turn to Scripture in the 17th Century. So thank you, Professor Fisher, for joining me.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Okay, let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Okay. Well, I guess I'm professor of Jewish history at Towson University and director of the Jewish Studies program at Towson, which has a wonderful group of scholars and experts in all kinds of areas of Jewish history. And I'm delighted to be talking about Amsterdam's People of the Book today, which was based on my doctoral dissertation at the University of Pennsylvania and research follow-up that was done at Harvard and Oxford.
Okay, so obviously this book has like two parts. It's about Amsterdam's Jewish community and about, like it says, turn to scripture, about the Bible, about Chumash, and their interest in that. So I guess these two parts of the book, how did you become, why did you become interested in this and studying this and writing your dissertation and then this book?
Sure. It feels like a million years ago, I became extremely fascinated and I guess hopefully excited about Amsterdam because I thought that I thought that I wanted to do a project on the early Enlightenment and its intersection with Jews and the Bible. And my kind of working assumption was that Amsterdam would be an ideal location to go to look for something like that because of the concentration of early Enlightenment thinkers like Pierre Bayle and René Descartes and others. And so I began the project, and to my chagrin, I found nothing of the sort. But I have never in my life been more delighted to be disappointed than in this particular situation, because what I did find was a Jewish experience and a Jewish perspective on the Bible and what it is and how it should be read, how it should be used and taught, that intersected powerfully with the world of the Protestant Reformation in the 1600s and the 17th century. And this led me down an entirely different and very exciting road and sets of questions and ultimately conclusions.
So you mentioned the Protestant Reformation, although that's not the topic per se of the book. I think it's something we should maybe discuss and clarify for the listeners.
Sure.
What exactly the Protestant Reformation was a little bit, and especially as it relates to the Netherlands, to Amsterdam of this time period. And Amsterdam was mostly Calvinist. Just talk a little bit about that before we dive into more of the Jewish community and how that related.
Sure, absolutely. So, I mean, in kind of its broad, most basic terms, the Protestant Reformation was a reform movement within the Western Church associated with Martin Luther and contemporaries of his, especially at the University of Wittenberg, that ultimately grows into a separatist movement that challenges and splits from the Roman Catholic Church. And then it sort of denominationalizes and confessionalizes into different streams over the course of the 1600s. And in the Netherlands, the particular brand of Protestantism that is actually the official religion of the Dutch state is the Reformed tradition following John Calvin. And in Amsterdam, I think this goes to the heart of, one of the parts of Amsterdam's people of the book, is the fact that Jews cannot escape being exposed to the literature and culture and ideas of this environment, and they're literally reading the writings of important Protestant thinkers and citing them and quoting them, debating them sometimes is a fact of life for them.
Yeah, and we can discuss this now or later. Is that why? Not to get too off into the Reformation, but why, especially that they were Protestant, does that matter more? And as we'll talk about, that the community in Amsterdam, which we'll talk about the community in a minute, was why were they more interested in the Bible and Chumash? And that has to do with the Protestant culture and the Protestant literature more than, let's say, Catholic and Catholic countries. Maybe you want to mention a little bit why that is.
So one of the Protestant tenets or doctrines or dogmas was that scripture should be used as kind of the litmus test for authentic practice within the church, and that the individual's faith and efforts to attain salvation sort of pivot on faith in the Word of God. And so it's a very biblicist way of thinking about the big issues of religion. The Jews of Amsterdam, one of the things that really attracted me to the Jews of Amsterdam as the sort of subject of this book is that Amsterdam is completely without Jewish settlement before the Spanish and Portuguese Jews arrive, who are most of the time descendants of conversos, forced and reluctant converts to Christianity from the late 1300s right up until the expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492. So in the late 1500s and the early 1600s, they start emigrating. They start going to different parts of Europe, Venice, Salonika, Bordeaux, London, England, and Amsterdam, and they start rejoining Jewish communities and practicing as Jews again, many of them. But what's particularly striking about Amsterdam is that all of these other places have existing Jewish communities that absorb, in part, these conversos. Amsterdam has nothing. That there's no established Jewish community there to model how to be Jewish, to provide structural institutions, to provide education or anything like that. There's nothing there. And so they're particularly liable, I think, to be influenced by things going on around them.
Right. And that's something. So we can get a little bit into the community at this point, which is listeners are probably familiar just either in general or from other episodes of the podcast where I've discussed this. And those familiar with, there's works by, I think, Miriam Bodian, right, has a very nice overview, and Yosef Kaplan and others. But you do discuss a little bit in the book. So you just mentioned the kind of an overview the community was. And at this point, mainly the book is focused on the 17th century. So not on the Ashkenazi community that comes later, but you're just focused on the Sephardic, so the Spanish, Portuguese community. So you gave an overview, and then I guess if there's anything more you want to add there, and especially, as it will, I guess, proceeds from there, from the settlement, they either bring in some rabbis, and then we're going to have some, like Menashe Ben Israel, who's from the community, comes up from the community, that maybe you want to mention them and the actual structure of the community a little bit more?
Yeah. So, I mean, originally the Amsterdam community was really very highly dependent initially on rabbis who immigrated from other places. So you've got Isaac Uziel from North Africa. You've got Saul Levi Mortera from Venice. You've got Yosef Salomo from Salonika, among others who come from different places. And it's not until a little bit later they start getting homegrown, sort of domestically trained rabbis from within the Amsterdam Jewish community.
Now, so you, as we've kind of hinted at about, so you're talking about their emphasis on the Bible, on the Chumash, especially as opposed to other communities, other Jewish communities at the time. Um, Explain a little bit more what you mean by this emphasis that they place, that, the more than other communities.
Sure. So I'll get into that maybe by anecdote first. I remember the genesis of, so one of the arguments of Amsterdam's People of the Book is that the Bible, the Tanakh, plays a unique and uh, for the time period, very atypical role in the life of this community, from education to rabbinic scholarship to cultural extracurricular activities for adults and children, all kinds of different things. And I remember sitting in the archive. This was in the Amsterdam Municipal Archive one day, um, going through record books of the community in Portuguese, and going through the documents and realizing that I was looking at a list of books that one of the teachers in the school had checked out from the library, from the community's library. And I was struck by the fact that this teacher, Abraham Baruch, who I later learned was a teacher of the mid-tier fourth classroom, I believe, he had checked out something like 35 copies of the Bible and nothing else. And then he came back the next year or another year, and I forget it was the year before, the year after, and checked out like 46 copies of the Bible. And these were minutely documented. And I realized that this must be what's going on in his mid-tier classroom. He's teaching, probably with enough texts, one per student. Um, he is systematically teaching Bible. And so I went and I looked closely at what was going on in all the different classrooms of the Bible, of the synagogue or of the community, and found this pattern where the curriculum of all of these different classrooms was focused on scripture, on Tanakh. And it wasn't until you got to the highest levels of the classroom that you would see anything else. I think they did Rashi's commentary on the Bible in one of the intermediate classes, but that was it.
Right, there was no Gemara until much later, and so I think we'll get more into the groups, the confraternities, and other aspects of this. But something really interesting, you already mentioned the curriculum and the education, and this is something that's really interesting because listeners are probably familiar with the kind of more Eastern European or Central European, Cheder structure, whatever at that time. That here they had there was a real structured school education in Eitz Chaim. So talk about that, especially for those not familiar. It's really fascinating. There's at least a chapter in the book that talks about this really, really interesting part of it. And obviously, so you're going to talk about how the Bible is emphasized there and talk more about that, but also just in general, Eitz Chaim and the curriculum and the educational structure that they had.
Yeah. So one of the clearest descriptions of what's going on in the school system here comes from a couple of East European visitors to the community, Isaiah Horowitz and Shabtai Bas, who, although obviously not members of the community, they visit in, I believe it's 1648 and 1679, if I'm not mistaken, thereabouts, and they are struck by the way that the school is divided into 6 discrete levels, each with their own kind of curriculum, and they remark on the different skills that are practiced in these classrooms. Shabtai Bas, in particular, notes that the young children are basically learning to read from a prayer book in the first classroom. Then in the second classroom, they go and they start learning the Pentateuch and how to chant using the trope, using the cantillation marks. Then they learn the rest of the Tanakh, and they start translating it, or what it's called, interpreting it, into the vernacular Spanish. And then eventually they get to the fifth classroom, and they start learning halacha, legal Talmud, legal texts in the sixth classroom. But we know that the vast majority of students in this community never made it that far. Because the community leaders and the teachers complain about that, and uh, they implement ordinances to try to address the fact that by the time people finish the third and fourth level of the curriculum, they have to drop out and get a job or apprentice, and they start giving scholarships to support students, hanging around a little longer.
Now, how did students progress through this? Was this an age-based progression, or eventually you just graduated? How did they progress from one classroom to the next?
It's an interesting question, and I think a little bit of a funny answer. The answer, in short, is it's skill based. So people are examined individually, or I should say, also in competition with one another very often, in very carefully controlled circumstances. So you have to have the rabbis there. You have to have the lay parnasim, the kind of wealthy merchant class that runs the community. You have to have members of that group there as well. And the rabbis themselves don't have the authority to advance students from one class to the other. It's the Parnasim who have that authority. And every now and then, the rabbis will be rebuked for kind of slipping something under the table and uh, unauthorized promotion of students.
I want to try that has to do with the community, the way it's structured with the mamad and the overall structure of the community that's different from how communities are set up now.
The rabbis were not allowed to moonlight. So they're not allowed to teach students they are not assigned by the Mahamad. They're not allowed to promote them without permission from the Mahamad, and the curriculum is set by the Mahamad.
Wow, and really interesting. And to go back on what you said earlier, you mentioned, so for those that don't know, so Rabbi Horowitz is the Shlah's son, those familiar, and Shabtai Bass is the author of the Sifsei Chachamim, on Rashi and Chumash, people may be familiar. So they talk about it, like I said, with praise, the system, and this was something that they were not used to, that where they were from, this was not taking place.
Yeah, this is totally anomalous in comparison to where they're from. There are some parallels with Italy. If you look at Italian Jewish curriculum, it is a little more heterogeneous than it is a little more systematic in the way it teaches Bible. But you have a very early and very diverse turn in the curriculum that, with the introduction of Mishnah, Talmud, and legal commentaries, Maimonides' works, very early in the educational process. And you don't get that here.
Right, and I think that begs the question. So why? Why is the Bible, why is the Chumash Tanakh playing such a singular role in this educational system?
And that's a great question. So, and obviously one that I've thought about for a long time. And so I think part of it goes to the fact that as conversos, so you're living in Spain and Portugal, nominally as a Catholic, maybe even as at least nominally as a Catholic, but the Bible is a sort of safe way to express a Jewish identity or sympathy, because the Old Testament is that sort of um, borderland shared by both Judaism and Christianity. There's a tremendous emphasis on the Old Testament within converso families and communities, especially illustrated by, I think, Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi's study of Isaac Cardoso. They name their children after biblical protagonists. Um, they observe uh, fasts discussed in the Bible. And so, having emigrated, I think that this emphasis on the Bible persisted. They institutionalized this emphasis on the Bible when they when they established their school system, the Talmud Torah. And I think you can really see how much of an influence the conversos themselves must have had on this choice, because the teachers were all from established long-term rabbinic Jewish centers. They probably would not have chosen to structure the curriculum like this on their own, but they did it nevertheless. I think the second way that I would explain the sort of focus on Bible, it never one question that I kind of wrestled with intellectually is that you can kind of see how it would have made sense as an initial choice for conversos and their immediate, in the first generation. But why did it remain the central focus of the educational curriculum and the confraternity, sort of extracurricular curriculum for so many decades and generations afterwards? That did not, I think the converso background did not sufficiently explain that for me. And what I think the kind of way that I've thought about the ongoing long-term commitment to biblical education is that this community had a thought about the Bible as having an especially significant role in their views about salvation, and the world to come. And that transcended just the first generation of conversos. It wasn't just about the cultural habits of secret Jews in Spain and Portugal. This was a theological commitment that they continued to have for quite a while.
Yeah, and obviously this was a community that was busy with salvation, Mashiach to an extent, right? Although Rabbi Yaakov support this was there when Shop Tzvi occurs in the community in Amsterdam, the community in Hamburg, and all over there, kind of caught up very much in that. As I had the Shop Tzvi series on the podcast. Listeners are familiar.
Yeah.
There's a lot of that discussed, obviously that goes on. So, you mentioned these confraternities. Perhaps talk a little bit about them. Listeners may not be familiar, Chonin
Sure.
and just some others. What are they, and then what went on in these?
So confraternity is a kind of society that is created, a kind of club, if you will, that has, at least ostensibly, a charitable or social service as its goal and raison d'etre, its reason for being. So you might have like today, you have a Chevra Kadisha today. So they had a Gemilut Chasadim that was in charge of caring for the dead and helping with make arrangements to bring the deceased person up the Amstel River to the cemetery at Ouderkerk, which you can visit today. It's a very moving and touching place to visit. And so the members of this community, the members of these confraternities, could be anybody from the community, from illustrious rabbis and their children and leading merchants, the wealthy, to people who never show up in the archives. Other than that, I did a little bit of side work on a couple of confraternities led by Rabbi Shlomo d'Oliveira, who is Menashe ben Israel's Hebrew student at one point in time, I believe. And I found leading rabbis of the community, one of the future leading rabbis, David Nunez de Torres, along with people who are so poor that they don't even show up in the tax records. And so the membership can be very diverse that way. Now, you think about these confraternities, they exist ostensibly for that social service, burial of the dead, or taking care of the poor, or the famous dowry society for poor girls that Miriam Bodian studied. But one of the things that surprised me when I dug into the documents of the Gemilut Chasadim confraternity for helping to bury the dead, caring for the dead, was that the very first clause in their charter is to establish a schedule for communal Bible study. It's not anything to do with caring for the dead. And it kind of spoke to the fact that this kind of these societies it regularly many of them regularly scheduled kind of adult ed Bible study programs for their members. And the ones led by Selomo de Oliveira, who one of them was the Kamilut Chassidim. He kept notes on their discussions of the Bible for something like 25 years. They studied the Bible literally cover to cover in these sessions.
That's something that's come up a bunch of times, that you've mentioned these records and notes, and the Eitz Chaim Library today and the archives there, they have extensive. We have many, very extensive records in a variety of languages, because they spoke and wrote in a variety of languages.
Yeah.
There in Spanish and Portuguese, right? There was Hebrew, and there was different things. So, I mean, well, you mentioned that Shlomo de Oliveira, he kept notes of this. I mean, do his notes tell us, like, so what were they studying? Like I said, these confraternities, they got together and they were just reading the Chumash. Like, were they just discussing reading psukim? Were they having their own interpretations? What was going on there in these group sessions, so to speak?
So he there I think his notes are in exceedingly densely written Hebrew. As it happens, he learned his Hebrew well from Menashe, one of the few. But so they're designed to be a kind of democratic, open conversation about specific biblical verses, where in theory everybody, it's a kind of opportunity for everybody around the table to share their perspectives on the material that he presents.
Yeah, now, I want to get to a couple other things before we get to another big part over here, is the rabbis and the different svarim and works published on Chumash, which there's a lot. Spoiler alert! But before that, you also talk about how there were tombstones. You mentioned the cemetery already, that had a lot of biblical motifs, inscriptions on there, and
Yeah.
I mean, not specific works, but also there was a lot of works published and written on the Bible. So, if you want to just mention that before we go on to the next part.
Yeah, I mean there are motifs. I mean, not all of them from the earlier time period, but you get some really dramatic depictions of people from of biblical protagonists. I think there was even one of anyhow. I don't want to get into too much specific there. Personally, I was always struck and moved by the way that the Amsterdam Jews depicted themselves and their families as trees on their tombstones. So a venerable old member of the community who died could be depicted as a large uh, tree with extensive branches and smaller ones for the children.
Okay, so now we get into the Rabbanim and the rabbis of the community, what they wrote. I'm reading from in the book on page 7 and 8. You talk about this, but these are those that are familiar. You mentioned Menashe ben Israel has the Conciliator, and Shaul Levi Mortera, as you mentioned, has the. I'm not gonna read the whole name, the Tratado, or I'm butchering the name. I'll give you.
We'll get into it.
Yeah, Yizgabov da Fonseca's Paraphrasi is not one that you talk about. And there's who else is here? Yosef Franco Serrano. But a lot of these are, again, written in the kind of their vernacular. They were not written in Hebrew, a lot of them. So anyway, we'll talk a bunch about these. So I don't know if where we should start. I guess we'll start with Menashe ben Israel. So first of all,
Sure.
I did a episode on him a while back with Stephen Nadler, and we did discuss some of the Conciliator. So for those interested, he has a biography of his, and there's other works written on him. But if you want to just give a brief sketch of Menashe ben Israel, and then specifically as it relates to the Conciliator and as it relates to Amsterdam's people of the book.
Sure, sure. So I focus on, in addition to the kind of social, cultural history of the first large chapter, I discuss two major rabbis from the community: Menashe ben Israel, who is born around 1604 and lives up to 1657, and Saul Levi Mortera, who is late 16th century, born in the late 16th century in Venice, to a German Jewish lineage, and lives in Amsterdam most of his life, dies in 1659, 1660. And I chose these two rabbis for a very deliberate reason, which is that um, Menashe ben Israel gets a lot of attention historically for his flashy diplomacy in England, trying to get Jews readmitted officially under Oliver Cromwell's Parliament, and for his relationship with uh, virtually everybody literate in Europe within the Christian world. He's well known as being the sort of ambassador of Judaism to Christian Europe. But what interested me about Menashe is that he devoted his much of his adult life to the project of the Conciliador, the project of identifying and reconciling every possible inconsistency, contradiction that he could identify in the Bible systematically. Mortera, I chose because Mortera wrote two major books. One of them, in English, I would translate it as Questions Posed to a Priest from Rouen, and the other, The Treatise on the Truth of the Law of Moses. So Mortera's his career was bracketed at the beginning and the end by major works engaging with the New Testament. And so together, Menashe and Mortera provide a window into how the conversos thought about all of the biblical worlds that they were connected to, the Jewish and the Christian. So that's kind of a prologue, I guess, to answer your question. Should I say a little bit more about Menashe?
So just before that, the Conciliador, so that has been translated into English. So
Part of it,
yes. Part of it, yeah. So that, right, correct. Now, before we get more into Shaul Mortera, so first of all, he has a massive kind of work of sermons of his drushes that is published called "Give Us Shaul." So that's a regular kind of quote unquote regular sefer of his. He was the big Rav in Amsterdam of the community at the time, very famous Rav. Like you said, he went from Venice. He ended up there. He accompanied Montaigne.
So Mortera starts off in Venice. He accompanies Elijah Montalto, the physician, to Paris, where he's at the court of Marie de Medici for a few years before Montalto dies. And Mortera brings him to Amsterdam as kind of the closest Jewish cemetery that is at hand. And he kind of stays. Mortera is hired as a rabbi of the Beth Jacob congregation in 1618. He's hired as a teacher in the Talmud Torah in 1621. And even though he's a German, kind of an ethnically German Ashkenazi Jew, he becomes this one of the few who are very highly integrated into the Portuguese Jewish community. Although I think Miriam Bodian makes the point that he wasn't so integrated that I believe they denied him admission to the Portuguese, some of the confraternities.
Now, this work, the Tratado, butchering it, was never published, right?
Correct. It was translated. It was popular. What the Tratado is a really eclectic manuscript that blends some kind of very traditional medieval Jewish topics with some very exciting, novel, and dangerous ways of arguing against Christianity and the New Testament. So, to put things in perspective a little bit, Menashe ben Israel's Conciliador, reconciliation of biblical contradictions, was denied official approbation by the Dutch authorities. So you can imagine that Mortera's manuscript would be even less welcome.
Yeah, for sure. So let's go back to Menashe, and then we'll bounce back.
Sure, that makes sense.
It was probably more Terra. Yeah. So with Menashe especially, and like you said, he was like you said, very fascinating figure, and he had his own press, and he wrote and published a lot of works. But as you focused on was the Conciliador. What specifically did you focus on there, and what, like we were talking about, obviously it's something about dedicated to Tanakh, Bible, but which aspects in particular were you focused on? What were you trying to, I guess, emphasize and pull out of it?
Sure. So there's a couple of things. So the Conciliador as a whole, it's 4 volumes of these contradictions and their resolutions, published between 1632 and 1651, I believe, which is the majority of his adult life. So this is a project that really dominated his thought and energy and attention as a rabbi. There's 2 aspects of it that really caught my attention. The first is that if you look, there's this claim that Menashe makes in the beginning that he's doing something that has never been done before in my nation and mi nación. And I mean, so everybody and their brother in the Talmud, knows of discussions about individual contradictions. That is not uncommon within Jewish society, within rabbinic literature. Um, but before Menashe ben Israel, no Jewish scholar wrote a book devoted singularly to resolving contradictory verses. This is a genre of literature that is enormously popular in the Protestant world in which he lives. So, John Calvin writes a Harmony of the Gospels, where where the Protestants, where John Calvin tries to sort of disentangle all of the inconsistencies, in the New Testament narratives about Jesus's life. Saul Levi Mortera quotes from John Calvin's Harmony of the Gospels, left, right, and center. So this is a book that is known in the Jewish community. Menashe is the first Jewish example of this kind of literature. So that's one element that really interested me. I focus in Amsterdam's People of the Book. So this is really something that shows how the Protestant world around this community influenced how they saw the Bible. In Amsterdam's People of the Book, I focus especially on the second volume of the Conciliador, published in 1641, where Menashe deals especially with mathematical and numerical problems in the Bible. So he's interested in the chronology of the judges of Israel and the kings of Israel and Judah. And he is troubled by the fact that the numbers related to these biblical chronologies seem not to add up. So the Bible famously tells us that there's 480 years between the Exodus and Solomon's temple, for instance. But Menashe ben Israel adds up all the numbers that he can put together and comes up with something like 570. And so what do you do? So what's interesting is that earlier Jewish commentators, earlier Jewish exegetes like Isaac Abravanel, for instance, are not troubled by this at all. They write about this Isaac Abravanel is actually quite funny about this contradiction. The details are really messy, but he comes up with something like 268 years instead of 300 between the Exodus and when Israel conquers Heshbon. Or when Yiftach says Israel conquered Heshbon. At any rate, Isaac Abravanel's take is that it doesn't matter if the number is off because it's just figurative. And he adds that because the person who said the number 300 was talking to an Amorite king, it's fine if he lies. It's just, there's no obligation to honesty there. Menashe, though, is living in a different time. Menashe demands precision, mathematical precision. He is so insistent on this that in one case, a contradiction about how long the Israelites ate manna in the desert. The text says 40 years, and Menashe can only count up 39 years and 11 months. And he's losing sleep over this. What's really interesting, and this is especially the case when you get to Menashe dealing with the chronology of the kings of Judah and Israel, is that he actually confesses that that his attempts to resolve these mathematical contradictions aren't successful twice, actually. He's very kind of open about that. And he literally leaves the reader hanging. He says of the contradictions in the reigns of Judah and Israel, he says, it is enough for me to show all the material here, and I will address this in another book, which never got written. And leaving the mathematical problems hanging like that is especially jarring, I think, for us to read, given what Menashe himself makes clear is at stake. Menashe makes it very obvious that the reason that he has to reconcile these contradictions is that there can be no error in the word of God. There can be no imperfection or inconsistency. He says that a number of times. And so to then just leave these openly unresolved says something. It indicates, I think, uncertainty about the very thing that he was trying to prove.
Yeah. So there's a bunch, I mean, if you have more to say on Menashe, Menashe obviously is a fascinating individual. There have been a lot of books and studies written on him and about him. I'm sure there will be many more.
Yes.
The book, you do talk quite a bit, even more about him. And then we've already mentioned quite a bit of Shalom Mortero. So you discuss him and his Tratado, if I keep butchering the name. And you talk a little bit about that work and what he was trying to do, what he does in there.
Yeah. So, as a kind of introduction to the Tratado, to the treatise on the truth of the law of Moses, and I guess Mortero's writings overall. As I mentioned, the Amsterdam Jewish community that I'm looking at was made up mostly of conversos, people who used to be Christians and now are Jews. And the shift that they made was a very long process, and it wasn't just a one-off process. These were people who, although they had embraced Judaism, they were intimately familiar with Christian traditions and the New Testament because either they or their parents had been raised in it. They had lived as Catholics. And so the transition to Judaism meant a kind of necessarily ongoing dialogue, not just with the Hebrew Bible, but also with their Christian scriptures and their Christian past of many of these conversos. And so that's really what Mortera, I think, was uh, was working on when he wrote both the questions posed to the priests from Rouen and the treatise on the truth of the law of Moses. What's interesting about Mortero's approach, what really got me excited about him, is that very helpfully, Mortera writes about the exact same New Testament passages in the work in his Questions to the Priest from Rouen, which is written in 1631, and in the Tratado, which is written at the end of his life. So you can see the development of his thought about Christianity over basically a 30-year period. And what's fascinating is he has a revolutionary turn in his interpretation of Christianity and Jesus and the New Testament. So at the beginning, in his first book, he is mocking, he's derisive, he's hostile and sarcastic. He has this very acerbic passage where he's talking about how Christianity got rid of kashrut and all the dietary laws, and he rhetorically asks the reader, and what would they say about isn't original sin Adam eating from the tree of knowledge? Isn't that food making the soul impure? Uh, but you fast forward 30 years, and all of this like dripping sarcasm from Ortera, it's gone. I mean, maybe he's more mature. Maybe he feels less like fighting. But he's also spent 30 years in the Netherlands, and so there's an accumulation of different experiences that play a role here. In the Tratado, Mortera, rather than being sort of hostile and mocking, he's looking for the common ground. He's looking for the ways that the New Testament actually reinforces Jewish beliefs and practices, or he's looking for ways that Jesus's teachings actually actually reinforce or support Jewish law or Jewish observances, which actually is very much in line with what cutting edge scholars of the time were doing in their scholarship of Christian scriptures. Um, and so what I do in Amsterdam's People of the Book is I try to account for this transformation. And the pivotal turning point, I argue, is Mortera's encounter, his literal face-to-face encounter with a member of a kind of extremist Protestant movement called the Socinians, that living in Italy, he never would have he had never heard of them. He could have met other groups, but uh, he talks about being completely unaware that this group existed in the Netherlands. And then talking with a member of this movement, he discovers that they have rejected major elements of Christian dogma and belief: the Trinity, the divinity of Jesus, the divinity of significant parts of the Gospels. And this is a moment of epiphany for him. In Mortera's eyes, these radical Protestants, the Socinians, are on the verge of becoming Jews. He writes that one of his main goals in the treatise on the truth of the law of Moses is to literally open the eyes of these Socinians and encourage them even closer to the observance of Judaism. So there's a great passage that I write about in the treatise on the truth of the law of Moses, where Mortera, yeah, how do you argue that the Socinians should be even more Jewish? Mortera decides to pick the Sabbath, um, to argue that they should observe the Sabbath according to Jewish practice. So how do you do that? Well, you take a passage from Matthew, where Jesus is rebuked by the Pharisees, of all people, for apparently violating the Sabbath by picking heads of corn in the field with his followers. And Mortera does kind of legal and vocabulary gymnastics in order to argue that we're not talking about the weekly Saturday Sabbath here, but rather one of the but a different day of rest, like the second day of Passover, which is a rabbinic institution, not a biblical institution. And so Jesus is no longer violating biblical law. Jesus is perfectly perfectly able to pick heads of corn if it's the second day of Passover. And so the message being that Jesus is observing Passover. Jesus observed the Sabbath fully in line with Jewish law. So too should the Socinians. When I talked about this passage at the my job talk for the position at Towson, and I was sitting next to an Orthodox rabbi who interrupted and said, "That's ridiculous," and it is.
Right. And again, this is Charlotte Mortera. He was a big, like I said, a big Rav in Amsterdam. So this is really very interesting. This is, just a little bit of what you discuss in the book going through his Tratado. So another a person that well, there's kind of two, but another big one. Obviously, there's the two famous heretics, I guess, in the community in Amsterdam, Uriel de Casta and Benedict Spinoza. So these you do discuss them, especially you do add a little bit, something new to discussing Spinoza. Oh, I should mention, I think Rochelle Levi Mortero is one of the main, ones behind or signing on the cherem, the excommunication of Spinoza from the community. That should be pointed out as well.
Yeah. So, I think one of the things that is important about Amsterdam's People of the Book is that Spinoza is this figure that comes from the Jewish community of Amsterdam, and he becomes, the famous philosopher. He becomes the famous, the person condemned as a heretic, as you mentioned. But nobody has ever asked how Spinoza's development might have been influenced by the way that the Bible was thought about and taught and studied in the community where he was born. And there's a passage in Spinoza's political theological treatise that really made me think about this question. It's almost autobiographical, from someone who doesn't really talk about himself that much. He says nothing about he writes that he's saying nothing about the Bible that he has not thought about deeply since childhood. So that gave me the idea to kind of map out how the Amsterdam Jewish community could help us understand Spinoza, some aspects of him that hadn't been emphasized as much. So you go back to the educational curriculum. Well, of course, he was thinking about the Bible in great depth, and only the Bible in great depth, because he grew up in a community that hit you over the head with Tanakh, and kind of pushed other forms of Jewish literature to a stage that Spinoza never attained in the school. It's not a coincidence, I argue, that at his death, the people doing inventory of his property, find a Latin introduction to Talmud on his shelf. This is a person who did not know rabbinic literature and the rabbis very well at all, and there's a reason for that. There are other points of overlap, but I think Spinoza and Menashe ben Israel talk about many of the same contradictions in the Bible. They arrive at very different conclusions, but they're part of the same world that is preoccupied with these questions.
Right. And definitely. I mean, so whatever we, talked about, there's a lot of really interesting aspects of the community. As I said, the book goes through talking about the community and the educational curriculum and structure, even more of the confraternities. And, there's much more discussion in the book than we've discussed in this episode by Menashe ben Israel, Rochelle Levi Mortero, and others, like Spinoza and others. So just to mention, something I mentioned much earlier, before as we wrap up, but Rabbi Yitzchak da Fonseca also has his paraphrases. You don't really discuss him or a couple of others, rabbis over there who did write other works and commentaries on the Bible.
Oh yeah. There's, what can I say? I mean, there's a lot of work to be done in this field. I think that the subject of the paraphrases has a lot of promise. As I look around the kind of world of early modern, medieval Jewish scholars, I don't think there's a tremendous amount of cover-to-cover paraphrases, translations of the Bible, sort of non-literal translations or rewritings of the Bible, like you get in Amsterdam. And so I think this is very much something that I think it's also worth mentioning, that this kind of centrality of the Bible here and this kind of biblical focus is really something that I think is the start of a phenomenon rather than kind of the end or just its own thing. I think that if you look at the way that Judaism develops in Central and Western Europe, there are a lot of parallels with what you see happening in Amsterdam as you get into the 18th century and the 19th century.
Yeah, and that is something that you mentioned in the book as well. Okay, so I'll put a link in the show's notes below if anyone is interested in checking out the book and purchasing the book. And finally, so what are you working on now? What are any future projects that you're working on?
So right now, I'm working on a project on the reception of Josephus Flavius in the Jewish community of Amsterdam, and particularly in Mortera's writings, and the way that Mortera mines Josephus for different kinds of architectural and archaeological information about ancient Palestine, and just the diverse ways that that he engages with Josephus, and kind of mapping that out onto earlier people like Azaria de Rossi and Isaac Abravanel.
Very interesting. So thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
Discuss the book.